This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, I'm Tone Lanzillo, and on behalf of the worldwide teach-in on climate and justice that is sponsored by Bard's College's Graduate Programs in Sustainability, Climate Justice is presenting a speaker series or Zoom talks with 4 different authors that have written about the climate crisis and climate justice. And for today, I would like to welcome Cynthia Kaufman. Cynthia is the author of the book, The Sea is Rising and So Are We, a Climate Justice Handbook. Cynthia, it's really great to have you with us today. Really appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Oh.
No, that's okay. And I thought maybe just to begin, if you could share a little bit about your book or other writings and the work you're involved in right now.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Sure. So I'll start with that. So yeah, the Sea is Rising and So Are We is a climate justice handbook. So I wrote the book basically to give anybody who's interested in working on the climate from a climate justice perspective, everything they need to get started and get to work. And I do want to say that pretty much everywhere I go right now, what I want to say is there's lots of work to be done. The next 25 years are the most consequential in the history of the human planet. And we've all got a place to do work on that. So that's kind of my thing. I do have a new book that's coming out at the end of the month called Consumerism, Sustainability and Happiness that looks at the question of like, can we get to a sustainable world kind of given how driven people are for consumption? And that's just a separate thing I wanted to mention that. I myself as an activist, I work in the fossil fuel divestment movement. And I'll talk about that a little bit kind of as we go on. So yeah, and so what one of the things that I argue in the book is and this is becoming, I would say, increasingly clear, is that everything we have to lead a modern, comfortable, joyful world in a sustainable way is already there. In other words, and Mark Jacobson is one of my favorite authors on this. He's an engineer from Stanford who did like sort of deep analysis of, is there enough lithium? Is there enough space? Can the grids handle it? You know, all those sorts of things. And really the answer is, this is the really good news, is that the technology is all completely there to get us to a sustainable world. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy, right? I mean, I in fact think, you know, the IPCC goal that we need to get to 1.2 degrees centigrade or Celsius above, you know, historical temperatures by 2050. In order to have things not be completely and totally disastrous. It now looks like we are on target to overshoot that, though there are now people who think if we haven't completely lost our chance. If we do everything right, we may overshoot and then come back down to that level. But that's the level at which of heating at which the planet needs to stabilize. The technology is there. The science is clear. What's getting in the way is politics. And so we really do need to have, you know, but somebody said this the other day, I thought it was really nice language. We need to get to the social tipping point before we get to the kind of climate tipping points. And I do think this is one of those things where history is speeding, right? Processes that seemed like they would take forever are starting to move more quickly. So in the book, I sort of talk about that. What are the big things that need to happen to get us to that point of kind of a sustainable, livable world? And I also have a chapter on what that world looks like. You know, I was so happy with the Green New Deal and that kind of rhetoric that says, again, kind of gives us that vision of that better world. So to me, that vision of the better world is one where we don't have 7 million people a year dying from air pollution, but rather we have clean air, we have public transportation, we have sustainable cities, we make sure that we build in resilience for people whose lives are being truly destroyed by the climate crisis. One interesting thing that we have to think about too is, as the climate disasters that at this point are inevitable, and we're already all experiencing them, as those accelerate, you're going to see some kind of counter moves from as people get afraid, they often become more sort of reactionary in their politics. So one really crucial thing to think about is how to deal with that reactionary politics, and also how to deal with the inevitable levels of migration that are going to come. And so I think it's really important that we have a pro-immigrant, pro-immigration policy as part of what we're arguing for. So that sort of, that beautiful sustainable world is completely possible. Even if you think about global population is headed towards leveling off at a level at which we can have, again, sort of, you know, modern, comfortable, not consumerist, but comfortable lives. So that's all really possible. We can get there. So what's getting in the way? One of the most important things that's getting in the way is the power of the fossil fuel industry. And that's why my own climate activism has been focused on trying to get the giant pension systems in California to divest from fossil fuels. I live in California. It's a great sort of local target. I'm going to talk a little bit later about kind of finding your perfect target, your perfect place in the movement. But for me, that's my place in the movement. And and there's a whole movement happening now around getting the banks. Okay, one piece of this is to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry, because they are the most powerful industry in the history of the world, and they are doing everything they can, in spite of some kind of advertising that they do that's mostly entirely BS, but they are doing everything they can to slow the transition so that they can burn the fossil fuel assets that they have that are the core basis of their wealth. The fossil fuel majors will not get on board in the time we need. So we need to just cut their political power. And so the idea of divestment is to say, these, just like you wouldn't invite a murderer to the dinner table, because doing that says that whatever they've done is sort of socially acceptable. You don't invite fossil fuel companies to the table of our kind of political conversations. So the idea is to both take away the social license from the fossil fuel industry so that they stop getting in the way of the policies that we need to make the transition we need to make very quickly. And then also there's a movement, Third Act has been, you know, spearheading this to basically try to stigmatize the financing. So to go after the four biggest banks, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and Citi, that are responsible for a lot of the funding of putting in new fossil fuel infrastructure. So and just keeping those companies kind of, you know, powerful and moving. So it's the fossil fuel industry and their grip on politics that's the most important thing that's putting a brake on the transition, which is, like I said, at this point, pretty clear what the path is. And so then if you think about that, okay, so the fossil fuel industry is like the big evil bad guy in this situation, but then the next level has to do with our political systems, right? Like, why is it that industry has so much of a chokehold on our politics? And the answer to that, obviously, is the role of money in politics. And you think about, you know, I know for a long time I was curious about, or in the early days when we first started hearing about Koch Industries, it's like, why are these right wingers so intent on kind of fostering this kind of right wing reactionary, you know, white supremacist, extremist kind of, you know, button push kind of politics? And the answer, if you read, Jane Meyer has this fabulous book, whose name I've just forgotten, of course, but anyway, that basically unveils how much Koch is a fossil fuel company, and the whole sort of premise behind all that work, which is now succeeded in controlling our Supreme Court, in, you know, completely controlling the Republican Party and big parts of the Democratic Party. The point behind all of that is to keep the fossil fuel industry in political power. So that's really important. The other thing is that, unfortunately, the climate crisis is coming at a time when the sort of dominant form of capitalism is neoliberal capitalism, the idea that businesses should be able to do what they want with the least amount of regulation. So we have a real uphill battle to argue for the need to regulate tremendously, right? So again, in this country, I think it's important for anybody in the United States to really focus on the United States in its role. We should be providing 30% at least of the financing for the transition for other countries. We're also sort of the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases. And we also are the richest or one of the richest countries on the planet. So there are plenty of resources in this country to get to making the transition if we can get the politics right to do that. So it's the fossil fuel industry. It's the sort of the way we think about regulation that's really important for us to understand the need for really serious regulation to not allow pollution to happen anymore, really, right? Fossil fuel pollution. You know, one rule in California is by 2035, there will be no more gas vehicles sold in my state, right? So rules like that need to be pushed out at an incredible rapid rate. Okay, now I want to think about you and what you can do, because again, my biggest goal whenever I'm not doing my own activism is to get other people involved in the movement. So I have a couple chapters in the book about this. I think it's important for every person to find their place. So think about the institutions around you. And what I would say is your own personal consumption matters, but it only matters as almost like just basic personal hygiene. You should brush your teeth. You should be kind to people. You should not fly casually or eat meat any more than you have to. Those are sort of just like almost like basic ways to be a sort of decent person in this world at this moment. But those things, your own making those choices around those things is not what's going to make it so that we get to where we need to get. To get to where we need to get, we need to shift institutions. And I'll say that anywhere you live, there's probably a school that's not transitioning fast enough, a place of worship that's not transitioning fast enough, a local town, a county, a state. There's something that you can do. You can work to get people elected who are going to, as political people who hold power, to get them to do what they can to make the change as fast as possible. But there's also almost any institution in this country. So I teach at a community college. My college has a sustainability plan. I'm on the sustainability committee. We're trying to make sure that we do our, recycling better so that there's less methane. We're trying to, get off gas and onto electricity. So just as a person in that, I may not be an expert at those things, but I can be a voice that's always saying, are we doing as much as we could be doing? And then, of course, so that all what I'm describing is kind of what we call inside politics, get inside of systems and move them from the inside. And then there's outside politics, which means you're on the street, you're getting arrested in civil disobedience, or you're just showing up to protest. But the idea of outside politics is you're putting pressure and exposing such that what becomes possible for inside political actors shifts. They call that the Overton window. It's like what's possible for a politician to do at any moment is really impacted by the people who are putting pressure from the outside. So I would say for any individual person, you have to think about where to put yourself that you're going to make a difference. And I would encourage you to do that sort of institutional analysis, and then also do the personal analysis, because some people like being troublemakers and yelling and screaming, and they have the privilege to risk arrest. Some people don't like that. They want to just do like writing letters, and that sort of thing. So I would just encourage you to find the right flavor. And so I have a whole chapter in the book kind of about that, about finding your right place. And actually I'm going to, after I stop talking, I'm going to drop a couple links in the chat, but I have I have my author website, and on there I have a document that's advice for joining the climate justice movement. It kind of talks through all these things about what are the organizations, how to think through the thing to find a place. And the other thing I would say is that some people, we live in such an individualistic society that I think some people don't think about what it takes to sort of build the community to make social action possible. So what I would say is, really pay attention to group dynamics, pay attention to what makes it such that wherever you're doing work, it's welcoming, that somebody shows up, that you give them work to do, that you make them feel appreciated in the work that you do, that you really think like an organizer. What do you need to do to kind of create a container for the work that you're doing to be successful, and really pay attention to those dynamics. My job, I actually teach community organizing, and we have a community organizer training program and a certificate. And those kinds of things, they're obvious if you think about them, but people often forget to think about them. What's it going to take to make it such that the group that you're doing is thinking strategically and is being effective and is being welcoming? Last thing I want to talk about just for a minute is climate grief and anxiety. I think that there are a lot of people who, the alarm bells are being rung. Finally, after, 20, 30 years, they're being heard. Lots of people are in that moment of like, oh my goodness, we're about to face a cliff. And I think the best thing you can do if you're feeling that way is to get involved. And that's, sort of obvious, but I'll tell you that for a lot of people I know, and for myself, that there's a few pieces to that. One of the pieces is just that if you sit around with anxiety and don't do anything about it, then the anxiety just builds. But if you're actually doing the work, you feel like you're part of something. And also, the people who are doing this work are incredible people, and they're very inspiring, and we inspire each other by the work that we do. One of the things I always tell my students is, you may think that you're just one person and you may feel overwhelmed by the work, but remember, there's at least 1 million people in the world who are doing this work, right? And so you're joining a team of at least 1 million people who are all pushing together to make this happen, and you can be part of that team, and there's something very satisfying. The other thing I found for myself is that knowing that I'm a part of a team that's doing all of this work, I also know about the work that's happening. So the closer you are to sort of climate transition work, the more you know that, all kinds of things are happening. Because I still have friends who say it's so frustrating that nobody's doing anything about the climate. And that's just not true. There are people all over the world who are, and including in every community that we're in, who are doing really significant work for the climate. So I just think it's important to understand that. And so that your climate grief, your climate anxiety can actually be sort of settled in some ways by being inspired by all the work being done by other activists, and also in terms of kind of systems and institutions and how much they're shifting. So I think I maybe just want to stop there and open it up for dialogue, and I'll drop a couple links in the chat.
Thanks, Cynthia. In reading your book, which I've read several times, a couple of things I just wanted to ask about. You talk about the climate crisis being a threat multiplier. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, the idea of the climate crisis being a threat multiplier is that look, if you're very wealthy, you can relocate. I think about the fires that we've had here in California, where if you were a homeowner, you probably had insurance, and that insurance probably allowed you to rebuild. I have a friend who lost her home in one of the fires in Northern California, and it was really devastating for her, but she had the money to rebuild, and she's now in her new beautiful home. If you were a renter, you didn't get anything. If you were a homeless person, you got even less than nothing. So the idea of the climate crisis being a threat multiplier is that all the sort of race and class dynamics that exist in the world are just made that much worse as we kind of come up to the crises we're facing.
Right. And you may have answered this in part of your talk, but I know you have a chapter entitled Believing in the Possibility of a Better World. Mm-hmm. Given what you shared, is that basically by getting involved and getting active, or are there other elements to that?
Well, actually, what I do in that chapter is the stuff I talked about a little bit at the beginning, to say that, again, renewable energy is now much cheaper to install all over the world anywhere than fossil fuel energy. And even it's getting cheaper. Like if you just replace, the point is we can get to 100% renewable energy at a very low cost. So that's all possible. Again, it's possible to have sustainable cities. It is possible that so just the point that I want to make with that, and I kind of go through every sector, agriculture. Meat is a serious problem. I mean, they're making fake meat and all of that, and that might solve the problem for some people. But agriculture also, so in my chapter on a kind of another world is possible, what I go through is sort of in every sector, there are creative solutions to make it such that we can get to 100% sustainability, no more emission of greenhouse gases, without needing nuclear, without needing carbon capture and storage, which is the latest greenwashing thing coming out of the fossil fuel industry, without people having to be sort of miserable and uncomfortable and cold all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Where or when did your interest or concern about the environment and climate change begin?
So I myself have been a sort of a social justice activist since I was 20 years old, and I got politicized around my concern for U.S. support for the dictatorships in Central America in 1980 when I was 20 years old. And so I've been involved in that work for a long time. And for me, I had always thought of environmental work as somehow not as deeply justice oriented. And it's sort of, I really care about people. I care about people in the global South. And it wasn't until, oh gosh, about 20 years ago that I started hearing people talk about environment in that way that you're saying about the threat multipliers, that really, if we want to have a world that works for all people, we have to take the environmental crisis really seriously. And so for me, once I saw the environmental crisis as a social justice issue, it kind of fit into my own personal framework and way of seeing the world. And I read a book called Heat by George Monbiot. Again, this was, I think, maybe 2008 or 9. And also he made the case that it was possible to get to a just transition. And I think sometimes when people talk about the environment, it's all gloom and doom. It's all like, look at all the terrible things we're doing. And I don't really want to think that way. I want to think about the solutions. So again, for me also, my climate activism was really, really sped up by that sense that a solution is possible and will be better for everybody. Gotcha. There was a question in the chat, but let me just see. Oh, okay. So in the chat, it says the cover image is young people advocating for climate justice. What are some examples from youth climate activism that are most inspiring for me? Yeah. So the youth who are on the cover of my book, I actually know them. So there's a fabulous organization working here in California alongside me that's called Youth versus Apocalypse. And they're this wonderful environmental justice group, really most strong in communities of color in Oakland. And so they are working alongside my organization, Fossil Free California, on this whole thing about getting the pension funds to divest. So that's been super inspiring. And then, I mean, Sunrise Movement was amazing. I will say that was an example of young people who really promoted the idea of a Green New Deal and did a huge amount of the legwork and activism and protests to get to the point where Joe Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which in spite of its name is the biggest piece of climate history, climate legislation in the history of the country. So I think the Fridays for Future, the youth climate strikes have been enormously important in shifting the conversation. And I will say to any young person who watches this, one of the things I've noticed is that when young people show up, adults don't act quite as stupid. There's a way that we can kind of get into this like, wow, wonky way of thinking about the world. And then when young people show up and say, you're ruining my future, this is unacceptable, it just clears the air in a way that I find really, really helpful.
And also there was another question, I think from a student about, the question was how, if possible, to engage the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, so I'll say that as I've been working on the divestment movement, which basically says we're trying to take away the social license from and marginalize the fossil fuel industry, the strongest counter argument we get is from people who say we need to engage with the industry to try to get them to shift. And I will just say, when you see, you know, the revelations that have come out that the fossil fuel majors have known for decades that what their product was going to cause, and they funded disinformation for all those years, they are still trying to stop legislation at the federal level and in most states in this country. They're actively on the side of doing all of that. So I don't think there's any positive engagement with the industry. I think we have to shut them down. I really do.
Gotcha. Given that I know this kind of work can be very challenging and sometimes frustrating, I'm always interested in asking people what inspires or motivates them. So I guess to you, what or who inspires or motivates you?
Oh, you know, it's just a passion for other people and for a livable world. I mean, honestly, it's like I'm really afraid for the future. I'm really afraid for the future. You know, that's just, I mean, it's yeah. And so that's what inspires me. And I will say also that before I was a climate activist, I was a social justice activist, and I, you know, have been very concerned about sort of racism, inequality, poverty, empire, the problems of the global South. Those are the things that kind of my whole life has been about. And two things. On the one hand, we're not going to have any of those kind of things like ending global poverty, ending poverty in this country. We're not going to get to that if we don't solve the climate crisis. And I actually feel quite, what can I say? There's a part of me that's really excited about this moment. I mean, it's terrifying, but also if we solve the climate crisis, in that process, we will also have to solve the problem of kind of runaway unregulated capitalism and deep inequality and all those things. We're actually going to have to solve those problems in the process of solving the climate problem. So I don't want to be Pollyanna about this, because I know that that's a way I can come across sometimes, but I really do believe, yes, the Zapatistas say another world is possible, and everything we're doing to solve the climate crisis correctly is helping us build that other world as we go.
Right, thank you. And given that some people here from Duluth, and we're right now, just for you, Cynthia, we're a population of about 86,000. In your section, your book, you did talk about cities.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to share a few things you wrote in your book about what cities can do.
Yeah, I mean, cities are exciting. You know, there's a way that sometimes our environmentalists think that to be an environmentalist is to live in a rural setting. But it turns out actually that cities are incredibly sustainable when they're managed correctly, because people have smaller homes, public transportation is easier. So when I think about a sustainable city, and you know, horrible as the COVID crisis has been, I live very near San Francisco, in a small town just south of the city. When COVID happened, all cities all over the world, including San Francisco, shut roads down and opened them up to people to be able to walk through them, right? And all kinds of, you know, areas that have restaurants, they got rid of a bunch of parking spaces and have those, they call them parklets, right? So those things that where you can shift a city to insist on boring stuff like moving from gas to electricity, having great insulation, right? There's some of that kind of basic stuff that has to happen. But then there's the fun stuff that's about, you know, bike paths and walkability and public transportation and, you know, just the idea of a city that's a fun place for people to be, that increases a sense of community. You know, I love Mayor Hidalgo of Paris has this, you know, she's really sponsored this idea of the 15-minute city. So the idea of a city where you don't have, okay, exclusive old forms of zoning that basically said, you have some things that happen in cities, and then you want to encourage people to move to the suburbs, which the suburbs is one of the most unsustainable forms of living you know, in the history of the planet, and it was really formed for racist reasons. So you get rid of all of that and you say, let's zone a city such that you have shops near where people live, and everything that you need, all the basic amenities that you need are all, because most people will walk a 15-minute errand, but they won't necessarily walk a half-hour errand. So if all the stuff you need to have a really cool, fun life is within 15 minutes, then you walk where you go, or you ride your bike or your skateboard. And you also then get to know people, because people tend to stay within their pod. And so to me, that's just such a vision of really how I think a lot of people would enjoy living.
Thank you. And in the beginning, you did mention this new book that's coming out. Would you want to share something about the new book?
Sure, yeah, and I'll drop a link in it too. So it's called I always the name just changed, Consumerism, Sustainability, and Happiness. And the idea behind that book is can we get to sustainability if everybody wants so much more new junk all the time? Like, that was just the question that's got that book. And I did a deep dive into that question. And basically, as I got into it more seriously, I realized that one of the most important drivers of consumerism is inequality. So if we want to deal with the sustainability crisis, we do actually have to get rid of extreme wealth. We just have to. And also that if you think about so many people in this world are unhappy because they don't feel like they don't have what somebody else has. And so kind of one of the paths towards happiness is to get rid of that kind of consumerist drive and inequality. All right, but Beth, I'll stop talking and I want to hear what you have to say.
Any questions? I know we've had all the questions in the chat so far.
Beth has her hand up. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, Beth.
You're on mute.
I'm trying
You're
to
on mute.
unmute.
All right, there. There's a saying, what am I going to do today? Am I going to save the world or savor the world? And the reason I ask is I'm asking to you, I think when I left education and environmental movement, it was hard for me because a lot of my energy came from being in the natural world. And then when you're in the climate, you're constantly hearing all the terrible things that are happening to it. But so how do you find a connection to nature that sustains you and savors, and what might that be? Because I think it's important, or at least it is for me, to find ways to counterbalance that.
Yeah. I mean, I personally am an outdoorsy person, right? I go backpacking, I hike a lot, and I agree with you in that sense. I'll also say that actually I opened the book, The Sea is Rising and So Are We. I open it with a story of a place in the little town where I live, where 17 years ago when I moved to town, it was just like a mud pit. It was like right near the ocean, and it was just terrible, right? All invasive weeds. And over time, it's now been, it was bought by the federal government. They've now turned it into a park, and it's gorgeous. And so like that savoring the world, to me, one of my favorite things is actually restoration, right? Places that have been devastated, that are then coming back, and that whole idea of rewilding, that there's something like the earth really can heal itself. And, just to say just a tiny word about that concept of rewilding. So often people talk about, we need to plant trees. If you do the right things to kind of like get rid of the negative things happening on a piece of landscape, and you pay attention and you make sure invasives don't come in and take it over, nature heals. I mean, it really heals. And so that sense of healing, I think, is really important. And so I love being in pristine landscapes, but I even more love being in restored landscapes, to have that sense that, if we stop doing the damage, the world will heal itself. Mm-hmm. And you think about savoring the world too. I mean, I feel like I love food, right? And I love to cook, and I love to get together with community. And there's all kinds of wonderful food and joy and community that we have as we're saving the world in ways that are good for the world. So I'm a save it and savor it. That's like cake and eat it too. That's my policy.
Yeah, I think you need both. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share with everyone that's with us today is that we are recording all the Zoom talks, and they're being shared with various local groups as well as national groups. And here in Duluth, PAC TV will be editing these Zoom talks and getting them on PAC TV and YouTube, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So we'll have an opportunity to share these talks with others. In closing, I always like to do this. I just want to share a quote from Cynthia's book that I often reflect on. And it goes as follows. We need to invest heavily in building communities that are socially and environmentally sustainable. We need to use social resources to invest in the things we need for a just and sustainable society. Cynthia, I just want to thank you for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tony. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate all the organizing you're doing and all the organizing. I'm sure lots of you on this call are already doing the work. And I just really, it's good to be with you doing this work. Thank you.
Right. We'll stay in touch. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.